From roughly 1525 until 1866, one of the darkest systems in human history operated across the Atlantic Ocean. During this period, an estimated 12.5 million African men, women, and children were violently torn from their homelands and forced onto ships bound for the Americas. These people were not migrants. They were captives. And for nearly 2 million of them, the journey itself became a death sentence. This voyage, later known as the Middle Passage, was not merely a route across the ocean. It was a calculated system of human destruction. By the early 18th century, European merchants had perfected the design of ships specifically built to transport enslaved people. These vessels were engineered not for safety or dignity, but for maximum profit. They were outfitted with reinforced hulls, mounted weapons to suppress rebellion, and additional portholes meant to provide just enough ventilation to keep human cargo alive. Below deck, shipbuilders added extra compartments, squeezing every possible inch of space to hold more bodies. The goal was simple: transport as many enslaved Africans as possible in a single voyage, regardless of the cost to human life. Before they ever stepped onto these ships, enslaved people endured brutal preparation at African port cities. They were stripped naked, robbed of their remaining possessions, and had their heads forcibly shaved, an act meant to erase identity, culture, and individuality. Boarding the ships was not a single event, but a process that could last weeks or even months. During this time, captives were held on deck inside crude wooden enclosures hastily constructed by the crew. To prevent escape, sailors stretched heavy netting around the ship's deck, designed to catch those who chose death over enslavement, those who tried to leap into the ocean rather than submit to a lifetime of forced labor. Once herded below deck, the true horror began. Enslaved people were crammed into narrow compartments with ceilings sometimes no higher than 4.5 feet. Many could not sit upright. They would spend most of the voyage in these suffocating spaces, chained, immobilized, and surrounded by darkness. Captives were separated by gender and age. Adult men were shackled together in pairs with heavy iron restraints. Women were usually left unchained but confined to their own sections. Children, considered less dangerous, were sometimes allowed to move freely throughout the ship. There were no toilets, no sanitation. Enslaved people were forced to relieve themselves where they lay or sat. Combined with extreme heat, poor ventilation, and overcrowding, these conditions created an environment of unbearable filth. The stench was constant. The air was toxic. Disease spread rapidly. Dysentery, malaria, yellow fever, smallpox, measles, and influenza tore through the ship's human population. Both captives and crew suffered, but the enslaved died in far greater numbers. Bodies were regularly dragged above deck and thrown into the sea. When weather permitted, enslaved people were brought above deck for approximately 8 hours a day. Even then, they were separated by reinforced wooden barriers known as barricados, designed to shield the crew in the event of rebellion. These moments on deck were not acts of mercy. Captives were often forced to exercise, which sometimes included dancing or singing, performed not for health, but for the cruel amusement of the crew. Resistance was met with violence. Those deemed disobedient were beaten or tortured. The most common weapon was the cat o' nine tails, a whip specifically designed to inflict maximum pain and permanent damage. Hunger strikes were also punished. Enslaved people who refused to eat their standard ration of rice and beans were forcibly fed, sometimes using a speculum oris, a medieval device used to pry open the mouth against a person's will. Women, though often unshackled, faced a different form of brutality. They were routinely raped and sexually abused by crew members. Many arrived in the so-called New World carrying pregnancies caused by their attackers. Yet, despite these conditions, it was often women, using the limited freedom they had, who quietly coordinated mutinies and resistance efforts aboard the ships. These rebellions, however, were rarely successful and usually ended in mass punishment or death. The full scale of the Middle Passage's cruelty was exposed in 1783 during a court case involving the British slave ship zone. The zone had departed from present-day Ghana in August of 1781, carrying 442 enslaved people. After a disastrous 2-month voyage plagued by navigation errors, 62 enslaved people and 7 crew members had already died. Disease was spreading rapidly. Fresh water supplies were dangerously low. Captain Luke Collingwood feared financial loss. Under maritime insurance law, enslaved people who died from illness were not insured, but those who drowned were. Collingwood made a calculated decision. He ordered approximately 130 enslaved people to be thrown overboard alive. He later claimed this was necessary to prevent the spread of disease. In the subsequent court case between the ship's owners and their insurance company, the owners argued that if it was legal to kill sick livestock to save a ship, it was legal to treat enslaved people the same way. The court agreed. Although the ruling favored the ship's owners, the trial exposed the unimaginable horrors aboard the zone. British abolitionists later republished the story, deliberately removing the ship's name to demonstrate that this was not an isolated incident. It was a system, and it could happen on any ship crossing the Middle Passage. 24 years after the Zone trial, the international slave trade was outlawed in both Great Britain and the United States. But abolition came slowly. Britain required another 26 years to fully abolish slavery. The United States would take 58 more years, along with a devastating civil war, before slavery was officially ended. The legacy of the Middle Passage did not end with abolition. Its scars remain, etched into history, memory, and the foundations of the modern world.